All right, welcome back. Today was weirdly warm outside, so I feel like we should just hold class in the lawn or something. Just feels really nice. And
I vote yes.
I'm kind of, well, let's see if we can end early or something, go for a walk. I'm kind of bummed that we have to be indoors when it's such a nice day outside. I have a lot of things to do today, though, so I want to get into it quickly. First off, though, thanks to Anu for volunteering to present something today. Can you join the Zoom call so we can see your slides in the recording? That'd be great. We'll start with your presentation. I would very much appreciate a couple more volunteers for some of these upcoming papers.
Recording in progress.
Thanks. We may not do them all next time, meaning on, what day is it today? Yes, so we may not do them all on Thursday, so you're welcome to sign up and we'll reschedule them for next week if you prefer. If you want to do them on Thursday, we could also do that, especially if you have yet to present. I can also just assign you. I know who has presented. Awkward stares. No? I guess looking away is a strategy.
This Thursday.
Not necessarily. We could do them on Thursday, but we could also do some on Tuesday next week, for example, if you prefer. You're welcome to sign up. Just add change the date next to your entry. So I remember to do them next week. All right, so then with that, let's do Anu's for today, and then I'll move on to other things. You're welcome to come up, I guess. I think the audio is going through mine, so you're probably fine being muted on yours, unless you prefer to use yours, and then I mute mine.
No, I think it's fine.
The floor is yours.
Okay. Okay.
Where's the sound?
Please review slides, I think. I think it's also bookmarked on the Slack channel.
Yeah, let's see. That was just, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm presenting this paper, Redefining Qualitative Analysis in the AI Era, utilizing ChatGPT for efficient thematic analysis. Yeah, so basically, the introduction and background was the researchers were trying to kind of see how like modern LLMs can reduce the burden of thematic analysis, because it's super important to qualitative research, but it's like really hard to identify appropriate themes due to subjectivity, and it's a lot of work and time and effort. So they basically wanted to see if they could give researchers, if researchers could actually use ChatGPT to do this thematic analysis for them. So they did this big user study where they had 17 participants and 4 pilot participants who were experienced with doing qualitative analysis. So they had kind of this like 2-part study. So the overall study was this semi-structured interview style thing where they first they talked with the researchers about the current challenges they have with doing qualitative research and like their experiences and challenges in general. Then they talked about their experiences and challenges with ChatGPT. And then finally, they got to kind of, and then they talked about their experience with like current qualitative analysis tools and software. And then they got into this experiment. And then in the experiment stage, they basically gave the participants a qualitative analysis task. So they gave them a data set and they asked them to kind of find themes within that data set. And they gave them basically 5, I guess, iterations with ChatGPT going back and forth to figure out how to design prompts to do this analysis. And then at the second stage, the researcher steps in and kind of helps them. So then the researcher and the participants co-design prompts together. And so the findings were first overall challenges with using ChatGPT. The researchers found the lack of transparency hard, so the lack of understanding of like what is happening behind the scenes with ChatGPT, like why are the results a specific way, and then getting more specific into that. Designing the prompts were really hard because the outcomes appeared to be random. So they kind of noticed that when you did small changes of phrasing and things like that, you get different results. And they didn't really know kind of how to navigate those the seeming like randomness of those prompts. Of those prompt results. The other interesting thing was that a lot of users didn't really know what ChatGPT was capable of. So like sometimes they would try to like they would be like, oh, I didn't know that you could generate a table using ChatGPT. That was a new functionality that they didn't know about. So then kind of they weren't able to fully utilize the LLM tool. Oh, oops. Sorry. Yeah, because they weren't aware of the capabilities. And then some researchers, sorry, felt like there was still a need for customization and flexibility. So like the existing capabilities of the LLM to kind of adapt to their needs were not sufficient. And so then this is like the design process for the for the experiment. And so then you can see here, like these are the general themes of strategies that the researchers found. So like, for example, like providing background to the LLM is a strategy. And then another example is like role playing. So saying things like, imagine that you are a researcher doing XYZ, whatever. And then an interesting one was acknowledgement of expertise, like kind of giving positive reinforcement to the LLM. That was like kind of an interesting prompt strategy that some people had. And then these colored dots are like no color is a strategy that wasn't employed by the participant. A fully colored dot was like a strategy utilized by the participant by themselves. And then the half colored one is like during like the co-design phase, like things that were adopted. And so as you can see, like many participants started out straight away with wanting to know, with asking the LM specific or giving the LM specific prompts around background and understanding, and then also like asking it for transparency and traceability. So like asking it to explain its reasoning behind things. And then things that were kind of adopted later were tended to be things like providing a specific data format. So that was pretty interesting. And then the other things that participants pointed out as advantages for doing like the prompt engineering design process was that the iteration was allowed for more flexibility, and the interaction in natural language is like significantly easier. And then, yeah. And then participants kind of reflected at the end of the session. And through the reflections, researchers found that researchers generally had more of a increase in trust and transparency after like kind of learning how to use ChatGPT for these tasks. And all like of course they like kind of understood more of ChatGPT's like capabilities. And then takeaways are prompt engineering is really challenging, and using LMs for qualitative analysis is still kind of at an early stage. And then I think I'm also curious, this was more my personal curiosity, but I'm curious about how this experiment would go today. And if you gave people different models, and if you concealed what the model name was, like how that would kind of, how people would feel about trust and transparency if you, because I feel like ChatGPT has a different reputation than Claude or any of these models. So that was just something I was curious about. yeah, I think that's all I have.
Thanks. Thoughts?
So, do the findings of the paper talk about the inherent subjectivity of the task and are ChatGPT generated analysis sort of more or less subjective, and how do participants evaluate that?
I don't remember because I read this paper kind of a while ago. I think that the focus of the paper did seem to be a lot more around how much the LLM was aligning with the researchers' own viewpoints and kind of their own interpretation of how things should be.
Was there any discussion about like, since so many people, I think like on the table that you showed with like the colored circles, so many people are looking for transparency and traceability, is that a concern because they're like the analysis that they're getting from the LLM isn't matching like what they would expect, or it's like?
No, I think it was more just that they wanted to make sure that the themes that arose like made sense. I think that there's just a general inherent lack of trust, because especially if you consider like the other confounding factors of like small changes, like one observation that participants had is like small changes make kind of random differences in how things emerged after using the prompts. And so there's like this kind of baseline level of like reduced trust, I guess. And so then, yeah.
So the interviews were conducted by the people who ran the experiment,
Yeah,
and then the participants in the experiment were asked to do whatever thematic analysis on the interview transcripts. Is that right?
no, they were given a separate task, like a separate, it wasn't like part of this, it was like just a different task.
What transcripts did they use or whatever for, what was the input for? The data they had to do qualitative analysis on, the participants.
I'm not sure what the exact task was, but it was just a set of transcripts that the people who were actually running the study had pre-selected and chosen for them to.
Okay, so the participants had not conducted the interviews themselves, they were not super familiar with the
No,
content of,
no, they were just like kind of handed the data, yeah.
but they were otherwise experienced qualitative researchers.
Yeah. Well, they had like varying levels of experience.
And was there some comparison of the themes identified by ChatGPT to the themes identified by, I don't know, the human researchers?
I think they were just kind of only using ChatGPT to find the things.
Okay, so like no value judgment on the quality or whatever, the agreeableness.
No, it was more like subjective judgment from the interviewees who were kind of looking through.
Who had also done the analysis themselves by hand or just used ChatGPT?
They were just using this because it was like kind of within the scope of the experiment. Like they sat down for this interview, they got asked a bunch of initial questions, and then they were just kind of given the data and asked to immediately go for it with ChatGPT and prompting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of hard to tell if it's good or bad if you're not also super familiar with the data yourself.
Yeah, and so from my read of this paper, it was more about like learning about how people approached the problem and like what strategies people wanted to utilize,
Yeah.
and what felt helpful and secure for those individuals, and less about like the actual content.
This was an ancient paper, correct?
It was 2024, yeah. Which is why I was like curious about like if you like, I feel like now in 2026 models have specific reputations and just like.
Yeah, so you've seen me update the reading list. All of the papers I added were newer ones that kind of talk about sort of how this has evolved and how people do qualitative analysis using LLM agents today versus kind of how they started doing this 2 years ago. So we'll see more of this over the next class or so. All right, awesome, thanks. More questions, thoughts? Okay, well, thank you. Yay. All right. So, couple of things. I mentioned this briefly last time, but just to tell you a bit more about this mixed methods idea. Just because you're thinking about your project proposals probably, and I've asked you to think about a mixed methods design. So what do we mean by mixed methods? Two or more approaches to data collection or analysis to corroborate, complement, or expand findings that would count as multi-methodology. I call this mixed methods liberally. I abuse the terms. Or to combine and integrate inductive research with deductive research, which is, I think, what technically the term mixed methods means, if you're to be strict about this. I am not strict about this, but this is sort of, I don't know if you want to be strict about this. Okay, so there are 3 familiar strategies for doing this. Go away. Okay, 3 strategies for doing this. One is the sequential explanatory. So you'll hear this word sequential used a couple times. So this usually focuses on a quant study. That's the main method. And you use a qualitative thing sequentially afterwards to interpret or corroborate or whatever, interpret the findings from the quantitative piece. So this is a perfectly valid, very common design that you could consider yourselves if it makes sense in your case. All right, so there's some quant data collection and analysis followed in sequence by some qual data collection and analysis. And then at the end, there's some interpretation and comparison and whatnot of the findings of the two. Okay, but emphasis on sequential. Okay? So that's fine. You could choose to do this. There's a complementary one that's called sequential exploratory as opposed to explanatory. So this is everything in reverse, meaning you start with a qualitative piece. Maybe you do a bunch of interviews or something like this. You build some theory and you generate some hypotheses. And then you test those quantitatively using some additional set of data and some analysis to accompany that. Okay. This was the impulse purchasing paper, I guess, to some extent. Okay. Also very common, perfectly valid design that you could use. Or the maybe least common, but maybe more interesting one is the concurrent triangulation strategy. That's the third one. So this is where you use the 2 methods concurrently, meaning at the same time. Okay? And this will help you cross-validate or corroborate findings as you're producing them. The advantage of something like this is what? Well, I guess it's on the slide. So no mystery. It's that you can adapt and adjust things you're doing in the other part of the study based on what you're seeing or finding in the other one. So the risk with something like this, and I've seen this in papers, even as reviewers, is that you end up with some misalignment. You end up not being able to measure the right things or what have you. And then there's some disagreement or misalignment between the findings of the 2 parts of the study, and it's kind of hard to reconcile. So that's one risk with something like this. So to the extent that it's possible, it's often not. A strategy like this, like the concurrent one, is more useful because it allows you to react and adapt. You could change your interview script based on things you're observing by, I don't know, analyzing data from the repository or what have you, right? And vice versa. You could go measure things in sort of reaction to what you're learning from the qualitative piece, for example. So this is sort of a good strategy when you can pull this off, doing them both concurrently. So I just wanted you to be aware of these three. They're all very, well, the first two are super common. I see them all the time. This one is somewhat less common because it's a little harder to pull off. But also you will encounter this. They're all good. I encourage you to refer to them by their respective names if you end up using them in your studies. Okay, so then another thing that I encourage you to look at, there is this empirical standards project. Have you heard about this? This not here? So have you heard about this before? The Empirical Standards Project in software engineering. This applies, I think, more broadly to systems and other types of research that's very similar. So there's been an attempt in the software engineering community to standardize the expectations for rigorous empirical research. So this is a documentation of that attempt. It lists a number of things that are must-haves in your papers, in your studies, and some things that are nice-to-haves, and some things that are optional. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can look at this yourself afterwards. But just just as an example, right? You have to justify why you're using the method you're using, right? That has to be there, right, in your paper. You cannot not have this. You should have this overarching purpose statement that explains the intent behind designing your study in this particular way. And so forth, right? You should describe the limitations of these different components, etc. So you could look at this, directly on the GitHub repo if you'd like. There's a good list, sort of a useful way, a checklist, if you will, to walk through your submissions in terms of, have I described this well enough? Will reviewers complain about my description or my study design? The other thing that's interesting here is this collection of anti-patterns, which I thought was interesting. So, for example, the uninvited guest is a cool name for an anti-pattern, right? When you there's some research method pops up somewhere in your paper, makes an unexpected entrance, maybe in a discussion section or somewhere, without having been introduced and motivated early on as part of the study design. And so forth. You'll find a good list of these anti-patterns here. So, for you as authors, the idea is that you would look at this and try to avoid the anti-patterns. And then, reviewers are, I guess, primed to look for these and to look for signs of these in your submission. So, they may complain if they see instances of this. This one comes up all the time, which is why I was talking about how the concurrent strategy is the hardest to pull off. Poor integration of findings from the different methods. This is something that reviewers complain about all the time, right? It's like, you're not really using to the extent possible the fact that you have this mixed methods study. It looks like you just have two studies that are independent that you happen to tag one after the other so that you would satisfy reviewer expectations, but you didn't really leverage the fact that you have this mixed method design. So that's something that comes up a lot in reviews. Okay, so you could look at this afterwards. The other thing that's interesting is they have a list of invalid criticisms. So this is meant at reviewers to train people to not complain about things they shouldn't complain about. So for example, right, a reviewer might complain that like, oh, your study, your mixed method study is not well balanced. Most of your paper is spent on the quantitative piece, say, and very little is spent on the interviews or something. Right? So, they could complain about this. That is not a valid criticism, right? You're perfectly entitled to design your study in whatever way makes sense to you, and to have more focus on one or component or the other. They need not contribute equally, and so forth. So, for example, they could complain that, I don't know, it was not necessary for you to do interviews. Why did you bother? Well, you did them because it was useful. It was beneficial. It added something. Yes, it was not necessary, but it was useful. So that's not a valid criticism, and so forth. The advice here is to consider these possible complaints. So this is a distillation of, anecdotes from the community, right? People have served on these program committees for decades, and they have a good sense of kind of what people complain about. The advice for you is to consider these and defensively write your papers in such a way that preempts these criticisms. Okay, any questions on mixed methods? So I'm going to put the deck up on the website, and you can look at this on your own afterwards as a resource. All right. So with that, I want to talk about survey design. So we're slowly moving towards more quantitative parts of the class. I want to start talking a bit about designing surveys. This is the list of things that I have read to prepare this lecture. You can find them all in our reading materials. Okay, so why do a survey at all? We do a survey for example, these kinds of purposes, right? We want to gauge the prevalence of something, like how common is a certain thing, a practice or a phenomenon or something like this. We want to measure the relationship between some variables, right? We could run surveys collecting data on both of those variables, and then we can use, statistics or something on the responses we get back and measure these relationships between variables. Similarly, we could look for differences between subpopulations of respondents to the survey. That's often an interesting thing to do, right? You can survey different subpopulations and compare their responses. So a few examples. The most common type of survey you will probably encounter is the probability sample survey, meaning you sample from some population, number of people, and you invite them to respond to your survey, with the goal of generalizing your findings to the whole population. Have you seen any example of a survey like this ever in real life outside of research?
Election.
That's like the super common one, election polling. It's exactly what happens with election polling. People never ask literally every voter in the country who they're going to vote for, because that'd be too many. They draw a sample of voters and they ask them who they are likely to vote for, and then they try to generalize and make predictions about the outcomes of elections from the results of surveying that small sample of people. So this is called a probability sample survey. Okay, so the main goal when designing something like this is to reduce survey error, meaning the difference between whatever you estimate using survey data from the responses and whatever the true value of those variables is in the population you hope to describe. For election polling, you hope to reduce the difference between your predictions of how many votes a particular candidate is going to obtain and how many votes they will actually be obtained, once the election happens. Okay. So you want to be as close to the real number as possible with these. So there are 4 types of errors that make that hard to achieve, as follows. First off, we talk about coverage error when we talk about the sampling frame. The sampling frame is the set of people from which we're sampling survey participants. Okay, that's called the sampling frame. And there's a question of how you construct this sampling frame. Right, so you invite a number of people to respond to your survey. Some of them may respond, some of them may not. We're going to talk about non-response in a minute. But the people you choose to invite to your survey, right, that sample of people is drawn from the sampling frame. Okay, so what's the sampling frame for election polls?
People who are eligible to vote.
Right. So in that case, how do you find the people that are eligible to vote so that you can sample from them the ones you want to ask for their opinion, right, to your poll? Or here, if you're looking to sample, I don't know, CMU students who use AI to do their homework. Like, how do you find, right? How can you identify this sampling frame of CMU students that use AI to do their homework so that you can sample from them for your survey? Okay, then how do you actually draw a sample from the sampling frame? Do you draw it randomly or otherwise? Is it stratified? Is it convenience sample? And so forth. So we talk about sampling error when we talk about how you actually draw a sample from the sampling frame. Then there's the question of who actually responds to your survey and the extent to which the people that do not respond, right? Because there will always be some people that do not respond. The extent to which those people that do not respond are somehow different from the ones that did respond in their opinions about the subject. Right? They're obviously different in their willingness to respond to your survey. So that's given. But are they different in their political leanings, for example? Right? So how far off are you, right, by estimating, whatever you're measuring, right, from the sample of people that respond compared to your entire sample that you invite? So we're going to talk about non-response error in that case. And then the fourth one is similar to what we've seen before with when we talked about construct validity. So this is essentially measurement error, right? The questions you're asking on the survey, right? How valid are those? This is very similar to how you ask questions in an interview. So we'll see a lot of those biases that we talked about when talking about putting together an interview protocol. We'll see those coming back again here as well. So 4 types of errors to keep in mind as you're designing surveys and running them. Okay, so let's talk about them in a bit more detail. So this coverage error, so this had to do with the sampling frame. So, back in the day, for example, they would do random digit dialing of people with landlines, physical phone lines, from the phone book. Okay. So the sampling frame was people with landlines, right? And then you would randomly pick from among those, right, the ones to invite to your survey. Okay. But the question is, do people with landlines are people with landlines somehow fundamentally different from people without landlines in a way that might bias your estimates? And it turns out they are actually quite a bit. It turns out people that could afford to have landlines back in the day were quite a bit different, right? They had higher socioeconomic status, they were more affluent, etc. Right? People did not have landlines in lots of low income areas, for example. Right? So if you use this approach to construct your sampling frame, you have no insight into the opinions of these folks that simply do not have landlines. Okay, so this is an example of kind of coverage error. Or, for example, right, if you're doing an internet-based survey, right, the likelihood that, say, on the CMU campus, people do not have access to the internet is very low, right? Everybody probably will have internet access and might be able to participate in your survey if you do it here. If you run this nationally, right, there will still be areas where people do not have internet coverage, right? They do not have internet access. So this is an example of how just the construction of your sampling frame could potentially bias your conclusions based on the survey, right? Because you have no visibility into the opinions or whatever input from these people that are excluded from the sampling frame. Okay. Sampling error has to do with how you draw a sample from your sampling frame. Maybe you've heard this before. It's surprising, I think, the first time you hear this, how few people you need to have an acceptable level of precision from the sample you end up surveying. Have you thought about this before? So CMU has some 14,000 students. If you want to obtain a sample of CMU students for a survey, that's high quality, meaning something like 95% confidence, plus or minus 2% margin of error. You've seen these kinds of numbers in election polling. If you want a sample with these properties drawn randomly, it suffices to ask about 2,000 students, 2,050, like given the size of the population at CMU, right? So you don't need to ask all 14,000 for their opinion. It's enough to ask about 2,000 of them, and that would give you a high quality sample with low margin of error in their responses.
Does this assume that there is like a normal distribution of the kinds of answers?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. So, okay, so you might say, well, what's the big deal, right? So like, 2,000 is still a lot of students, right? So like, I mean, yes, you've shrank this a bit, but it's not that impressive. What if I told you that if you want to draw a similar size, similar quality sample from the entire US population, which last I taught this class was about 330 million people. So that's quite a bit larger than the CMU population. If you want to do that at the same level of quality of the sample, well, actually, you only need like a few hundred more. That's all it takes to maintain this level of statistical confidence by scaling from about 14,000 students on campus to about 330 million people across the country. Pretty cool how that works. So there's all kinds of tools for this. Just Google sample size calculator. You can find a whole bunch online that would help you determine, what a good size of your sample should be given some properties that you would like the sample to satisfy. And so these kinds of, 95% confidence, maybe 99% confidence, with some as small as possible margin of error, sort of what you usually encounter in practice is what people do in papers and whatnot. Okay. By the way, so also interesting, still a decent quality sample. I mean, sure, 10% margin of error, like being off by 10% in either direction is maybe pretty substantial. But if this, if you just need a, rough sense of prevalence or something like this, if something is rare or very common, right, this is still, good enough precision. Surprising how few people you need, right, to be able to make claims like this. Okay, so you've seen this before? Sampling? Some have not. Are we familiar with this notion of confidence in the margin of error? Bit? Okay, so I have a few things here. Maybe worth looking at this again on your own afterwards. So confidence interval or margin of error is this plus or minus figure that's usually reported. Obviously, lower is better. This is a sort of explanation for how this works. If, say, your margin of error is 4%, and 47% of people in your sample answer X, then you can be sure, and I'll explain what that means in a second. You can be sure that among the entire population, the one that you drew your sample from, the proportion of people that would say X, that would answer X, would be between 43% and 51%, so 47% plus or minus for your margin of error. Okay, so this is how far off you expect you would be when you go from your sample to the entire population that you sampled from. And then the sure bit comes in the confidence level, like how sure can you be? So basically, this means that if you were to draw a different random sample from the same population, how often would you get the same answer within the confidence interval? Right, so most of the time is what you're trying to get there, which is why you see these high numbers there, right? Almost always, right? If you draw a different random sample from the same population, you get the same estimate, is the idea. Right, so this is kind of how people think about this. And it's often a good, so like, for example, in a paper, reviewers will ask you, you say we surveyed, 184 people. And it'll be like, how did you determine that magic number? Why did you choose that? Right? So, a better defense is to preemptively explain how you use something like this, a sample size calculation, to arrive at the number of people you should survey. And then they won't complain. Another thing that I've often seen, speaking of anti-patterns, I've had to fight this on program committees. The survey had, I don't know, 800 responses or something. I don't know. I'm making something up. Huge number of responses. Okay? And so reviewers were complaining, no, that's not enough. It's not representative. Right? So, and then, then I, as another reviewer, I had to argue, like, actually, no, look, like, all you need is about 300 to get a, high quality sample, right? So like, having anything more than that is really unnecessary. So your criticism is not valid here, right? 800 is plenty. You should not worry about this not being representative. But this is, again, like something people like to nitpick in their reviews. You should be prepared for that when you can anticipate all of these complaints to preempt them. Okay. Yes.
Since we're talking about surveys, will you, in this section, talk about how we can try to prevent AI from taking the surveys, basically?
We cannot. It's over.
Well,
Well,
said part one, so not part two.
No, I don't think you can. I think it's very hard to do survey-based research. In fact, there was a paper on this, which we should add to our reading list, which talks about exactly this point about it's become basically impossible to do survey-based research because it's chatbots that are providing the answers, not the actual humans anymore.
So why?
Well, because we maintain a sliver of hope. I don't know. Otherwise, what's the... I mean, so, look, web-based agents can solve CAPTCHAs these days. And like, I think it's very hard to, like robots click on I'm not a robot things, right? It's very hard, I think, to defend against this. You just have to maybe trust that the people who you're asking to participate in your survey actually care about your problem and your research, and they might be genuinely willing to participate. But I don't know that you can defend against this fully. It's more like hope for the best. Yeah, Anu?
That was effective, like, at least a couple of years ago, for like people using LLMs to fill out survey responses and things. Is that still like,
But I mean, the models are better at stuff like this than the humans are, I think. My guess is it'd be very easy for an LLM agent to pass attention checks. Because it actually reads, the questions, right? It doesn't just like, click blindly on, answers to complete the survey faster so that, they get paid or something, right? It's a great question. I'd be curious if you learn more about kind of what people do to defend against this. Please teach me as well. I haven't heard anything interesting.
Could we do like some sort of like signal to noise ratio? And you can maybe also like use an LLM on our survey and I don't know, find some distribution of what our LLMs and like what we think might be users for LLMs and like I don't know, maybe we need a larger sample size, but
So yeah, I mean, I guess you could try if it's open-ended answers, right? And then you see a lot of delve and leverage, and it's not this, it's that type contrast, like some of these obvious things, right? So I suppose you could do guessing of human versus LLM provenance on open-ended survey answers.
I'm thinking also about this like signal to noise ratio filtering that we do for like sensors sometimes.
My intuition is that a chatbot would provide very plausible answers. So other than stylistically, right, which may be obvious in some cases, but I think they'd be very much on point, right? They would, they'd be in response to the actual questions on the survey. They would not, be off topic, I think, because it's very easy, right, for a model to do that. So my intuition is that the signal would be high, and the noise, would be low in that sense. Like I think they would be kind of on point focused.
I mean, like if we consider like the LLMs are the noise in like the overall sample.
Yeah, so this is a great problem. Let's see if we can find some papers. I'll look too. Maybe people have talked about this, some solutions to, I don't know, at least detecting and filtering out automated responses to surveys. There's got to be something. You're right. Maybe it's not so hopeless.
this, I had this discussion with my advisor today, and he told me to come talk. He was like, wow, you'd be a great person to ask about this. But he was saying that like his thinking was that, like if there's not like an incentive, like if they're not getting paid or something, maybe you're less likely to encounter this,
Yes.
or people are like spamming it.
Yeah. So by the way, speaking of getting paid, if you've ever tried to do Upwork or like some of these, I don't know, crowd sourced task-based things, like even years ago when we didn't have, LLMs doing stuff autonomously, there were these giant collusion rings where like people would set up all kinds of custom, infrastructure and whatnot, all kinds of elaborate ways of cheating on these. I feel like these days it's completely hopeless. I haven't kept up with this. I haven't tried to do these web-based studies anymore. So those you would have to pay, right? Something like MTurk or Upwork or whatever. Those you would always pay because they would be sort of elaborate things. So the incentive is very high, I think, to cheat on stuff like that. Yeah, I think for research purposes, we often don't have any compensation for participation. So maybe that's a way to reduce the noise.
Have you noticed like a larger shift towards interview studies just based on the advice of the increase?
Yeah, good question. I would say in my group, yes. I think we would prefer to do interviews with real humans over running surveys. We haven't done surveys in a while. Yeah, so maybe anecdotally, yes. I think that's a good strategy to reduce some of the noise. By the way, I've seen an extreme view on this. Last time I taught the class a couple years ago, there was a paper that had just come out that was saying, forget about like, all of this thing where you have to have an LLM reply to each survey individually. That's like super inefficient because like you, the researcher, then still have to analyze, 1,000 LLM responses and do something with all that data, right? So that's a lot of work for you, the researcher. It's like, what about instead asking the LLM directly to provide the summary distribution statistics of potential respondents to your survey, given some description of the sampling frame. So in their case, it was something like, imagine I'm surveying open source developers about this particular problem. Here's my survey. What would they respond? Give me the distribution of responses directly, right? It's like bypassing the analysis entirely, getting directly to the conclusion. So that's an extreme view.
YouTube, like, or influencers, there's a paper about like predict what your viewing audience will look like and predict what kinds of comments.
Exactly like that. Yeah. Yes. Same idea. Yeah. I haven't seen this done in a research paper yet. Have you? Has anybody? Where you run a survey that no human responds to? I'm guessing that's a no.
Sure, we can publish.
Yeah, I wonder. Okay. Anything else? This was fun. Okay, non-response error. We talked a bit about this. Yeah, so how do you reduce or defend against non-response error? So this is the idea that people who don't respond may be fundamentally different from those that do respond. For example, right, if you have it's like reviews, right, online. It's the people that are really angry about the experience they've had with your company or your product that are more likely to fill out the review form afterwards. So there, non-response error is huge. I think if you were to average out the opinion of all the users of a product, it will look very different, right, compared to the ones that actually respond, fill out reviews. So same here. So one strategy is to increase your response rate as much as possible. Okay? So the idea being that like the more you hear from everybody, right, the less likely it becomes that you're missing some opinions, and the less prevalent and common, right, those missing opinions will be, right, the more you've heard from other people. Right, so just increase your response rate as much as possible to reduce non-response error. Yeah, and there's some work that's showing that this doesn't always hold, and you can still be the few people that don't respond, even if statistically very rare, could be super different from the ones that do respond, the majority, and you're still missing a lot. But in general, this tends to be a good strategy. Okay, then measurement error is about asking good questions. This is similar to asking good questions on the interviews. So one example here, is using household income for the previous year as a measure of household wealth. Right, so they were asking people, what range of household income did you have last year to get a sense of how wealthy the respondents were. And this is an example of potential measurement error because people that just retired, will have much lower annual income. Income tends to decrease after you retire, right? You don't have a salary anymore, but they will still be possibly quite wealthy. So, using household income as a proxy for wealth is not a good measure if you want to get a sense of the wealth of retirees. Yeah, one example of measurement error. Okay, here's a case study. It was very interesting. So this was a survey of about 600 PhD students at Washington State University about their dissertation work and graduate training. And this was really interesting. So this is a timeline of the response rate to the survey. And you see plotted on this timeline different strategies and interventions the research team pursued to deliberately increase their response rate. I love this story. It's a great example. So, yeah, let's see. It started with an initial email, or was it letter? Yeah, postal invite. So it started on March 29th with a letter. They mailed a letter to all of the students or the graduate students on campus, right? They somehow had their addresses from, I don't know, university records, mailed them a letter with this content, writing to ask for your help with an important survey. Who are we, right? The researcher team, who's funding our research? Like, note some of these best practices for kind of introducing yourselves and whatnot. We're hoping you could spend a few minutes discussing your experiences. To do so, go to this website, enter this code. You should only take about 10 minutes to complete the questionnaire. Survey is confidential. Answers will not be linked to your name or department, etc., etc. Participation is voluntary. We very much appreciate your help with the study. And as a small token of appreciation, here are $2, $2 in the letter as a token of our appreciation for your time. Okay. So this letter got them about 8% in like 2 days or so. Okay, pretty good, or not. Then they sent an email. Okay, the email said something like this. It's basically a repeat of the physical letter. Hey, I'm following up with this email to provide you with an electronic link to the survey website. I hope this link makes it easier for you to respond. Okay. It should only take a few minutes to complete the questionnaire. Simply click on this link, blah, blah, blah. Signed, whatever. Okay. So the email got them a lot, right? So of course, people didn't really enjoy having to physically go to some website and type in some code or something. They would much rather click on a link in their email. So that hugely increased their response rate to about 49%. Okay, but they did not stop there, right? A few days later, or a week later, they sent another email. We're going to talk about this in a second. I don't know if I have the other email. Okay, they sent another email, increased the response rate still. Okay, they waited a bit more. After all of this, they printed out the questionnaire and mailed them again to their physical address. So kind of similar to the first letter. They said, hey, in case you prefer to fill this out on paper and you couldn't be bothered to, go to the website we linked to in the first communication or go to the link we mentioned in our emails, here's a physical printout of the questionnaire. Could you fill it out with pen and paper, with pen on paper and mail it back to us? Here's an enclosed return envelope with a stamp. So just fill it out, put it in the envelope, mail it back to us. Okay, for free. So that got them a bit more. And you can sort of see kind of what the breakdown was between the web-based surveys and the physical paper-based surveys. And then finally, there was a final email saying, hey, this is the last time we're going to contact you about this. If you haven't responded yet, please do so, something like that. Okay? So, but the morale of this story is all of these little things, right? They could all be different, but they all make a difference. So you should, be deliberate about distribution, try not to spam people, right? Be mindful of their privacy and their time and whatnot, but be deliberate about reaching them. So, to make sure that they get a chance to respond and give yourself a chance to get the responses. The other thing that's really interesting, right? So the $2 bribe at the beginning. Okay, this is really interesting. So it turns out there's a lot of research and theory about this. The social reward value of modest incentives is one good paper that talks about this. Okay, and people have done studies. For example, here, they had a control group where they gave no incentive to. They had a second group that they gave a very small incentive to. In this case, equivalent to the $2 thing you've seen here, sent out with the survey request at the very beginning. This is important, right? Not as a payment for people's time after they responded, right? But as a bribe ahead of time, as an incentive, even if they do not respond, right? They get to keep the money. Okay. And then the third group, they were paid a higher payout if they returned the questionnaire, right? So guess what happened? Highest response rate was among the people that got paid peanuts up front. Okay, because it created this sense of obligation. Hey, these researchers gave me something that I did not earn. I feel like I owe them, right? So I'm more likely to respond to their survey now, just because I feel like I owe them. I thought it was really interesting, right? Kind of paying it forward type of mechanism here. So what they did, in the survey I mentioned before with the $2 bill in the original letter, it was very deliberate, right? It was based on, some of this research. I guess the other lesson is it helps a bit to also give them something at the end, right? So that makes it even more likely that they respond. So both of these mechanisms can have an effect here, kind of a initial reward and post-pay. Yeah. Okay. So by the way, speaking of this initial payment thing, pay a bit forward. One thing that we have done back in the day, and this was at the time successful. I don't know if you can still do this now. But so, for example, right, if it's not actual cash, what else could you do to demonstrate that you give them something, right, before they have a chance to give you something back? Right? So one thing that we did when we ran surveys some years ago was have personalized invitations to fill out the survey. And as part of the invitations, we had attached some analysis of data from their repositories or something. We were surveying open source developers. We had done some custom analysis about their activity and about their traces. And we just gave them the results of that analysis as a nice report with the email invitation. We introduced ourselves, our research, etc., and we gave them the thing we had learned about their activity by looking at the public data. And I found this as an effective way to demonstrate to people that A, we're curious and interested, and B, we value their input, and we did put some work into kind of understanding who they are, and we value their opinion here. So I found this at the time to be an effective way to get people to respond to surveys. People seem to enjoy having this little token. But yeah, so some of these strategies are obvious. Others, like some of this pay it forward, I think less obvious. Obviously you can, try to be as transparent and honest with people as possible. You should try to, just like with interviews, we talked about this, you should try to invite people who may have a unique position, may be in a unique position to respond and help you with your research. They may be more likely to care about your research, if they recognize that they are in this unique position to help you with it, right? If they feel like you could have just as well asked anybody else and they could have provided the same answers as they would provide you, they would feel less inclined to participate, right? So this goes back to how you sample and what is your sampling frame. A good strategy is to be deliberate there. Plus, things like, you can mention that their friends have already responded. Like, hey, your other students in the class, 80% of the students in the class have already responded, right? Can you please respond as well? We really need your input. What's keeping you? Or right, so all of I find it super annoying, like all of these like airline surveys and whatnot, websites, they make it seem like you're very special, right? Like only a handful of people get asked to provide us feedback about your experience with this flight or whatever, this customer service interaction. But you're one of very few people that has the opportunity, unique opportunity to respond to this survey. Right. So I find that super annoying now that I've been through it many times. Yeah.
Something that kind of comes to my mind is, a lot of the people that kind of have spent more time or more their lives on the internet or something like that. And you see all these internet scams, all these fake ads all the time. I'm wondering if some of these kind of apply better for people that have spent more time online or have been exposed to this more.
Yeah, I don't really know, but one thing I did notice, at least in my world, I've done a lot of research for open source software development, which over the years meant talking to via interviews or surveys to a lot of practitioners. You I think notice, at least anecdotally in my experience, this people getting over surveyed and not having the patience and the willingness to participate in these anymore. I think there've been increasingly more of them over time, and maybe people didn't feel like they were getting enough value out of their contributions. So I think these days it would be a lot harder to do the kind of surveys that we used to get thousands of respondents to 10 years ago, when the community was much more excited about participating in stuff like this. All right. Yeah, some of this. Okay. So, okay, let's see how much we can get into this. A few issues with drafting questions. So let's start talking about some of these potential biases that might creep into how you ask questions. Have you heard about social desirability bias? Anyone? What does the name suggest?
Well, social desirability, like you select more attractive people or something like that.
Not in the physical attractiveness sense.
But you kind of have
Like someone, sorry, someone who is like more approachable, like has a lot of, I don't know, the more extroverted person has a lot of friends or something like that.
Yeah, good guess. No. Anyone else?
Ask questions because you want them to like you. Sort of leading questions in that way.
Yeah, so that's kind of the direction. So the idea is that when you ask people sensitive questions for which the answers could be sensitive, or to be more precise, where the answers could be perceived as socially undesirable, they are much less likely to be truthful, right? Because of this potential reputation loss that would come from being honest. So for example, right, people want to make a good impression. So for example, how often do you drive a car after drinking alcoholic beverages? Frequently, occasionally, seldom, never, or don't know. Okay? So if you ask them, in this case, if they ask them in a phone call with a human at the other end, at 63% said never. Oh no, I never do this, right? Because you know, it would be socially undesirable to admit that you're engaging in this otherwise frowned upon behavior, or maybe illegal, right, in this case. Okay. If you let people fill this out, you know, in the privacy of their home on paper, and they're anonymous, and they, you know, they can mail you back the responses, you get a different distribution, right? So people can be more honest if they don't need to make a good impression, right, with the researchers. There was another good example. Let's see if I have it here. Oh yeah, how would you describe your current health? Right, same phenomenon, right? So, you know, if I ask you how are you feeling, how are you doing, you're more likely to just say, you know, I'm fine, right? Because whatever, it's too, you know, it's too complicated to go into the, you know, actual nitty-gritty details of how you're not, you know, fine, right? You'd rather not. It's more effort, right? If it's not socially undesirable, it's at least more effort, right? So everybody's optimizing for efficiency, expediency here. So that's another example of this. Oh yeah, yeah, a couple more examples. Did you ever receive a failing grade in college? Right? I'm not going to admit that, you know, to another human if I can avoid it, because it's, I don't know, maybe I'm not proud of it or something. Right? So you'll see that the distributions of answers are very different. Or, you know, have you engaged in extramarital sex? Right? Same thing, different distributions depending on the gender of the interviewer here, right? If it was the same or different as the respondents. Right? People are less likely to admit to this otherwise socially undesirable behavior. So you can see lots of examples of this, and they can play out in all kinds of scenarios. Okay, let's do one more. Acquiescence. Has anybody heard of this? Acquiescence. This is about agreeableness. People will tend to agree with you rather than disagree with you. Just because disagreeing with you is, I don't know, conflict, and it's more effort. And most people are conflict avoiding that way. Right? Tendency to agree with you. So how does this play out? Depending on how you ask the question, right, there's this built-in tendency of people to agree with your statement. So for example, individuals are more to blame than social conditions for crime and lawlessness in this country. Right? So people's tendency is to agree with whatever statement, right, is in front of them. So you'll see, you know, high agreement here. Yep.
Isn't this more amplified in interviews?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, because people, like, since you're like interacting with a person in real time, there is more like evidence of rapport building and
And
tend to agree with
conflict is
one another.
clearer, perhaps, right?
Exactly.
In an in-person interaction. It's more immediate, right?
Yeah.
Like there's perception of escalation and conflict, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I would say yes. Yep.
I don't think this is exactly this thing, but I see a lot of surveys which ask if you like are satisfied or dissatisfied with something, and only if you check like you're dissatisfied with something, it asks why, which is a required form. And I think that it actually affects. So I mean, it creates a lot of bias.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So in the example here, you could see how depending on how the statement was phrased, right? You notice empirically this tendency of people to agree with the statement, right? Both of these cannot be true at the same time. Right? So, you know, people have a tendency to agree with whatever the statement is presented to them. Okay, so I guess good time to pause. There's a few more of these we can pick up on Thursday with some of these biases that creep up and maybe a few strategies for defending against them. How does that sound? Okay, then I shall see you on Thursday. Let's still enjoy the outdoors for a minute before it gets too cold or too dark.